Russian Blues Rainbow Solidarity. At first glance, the 9 oil paintings in Yevgeny Fuchs's 2013 series Pleshkas of the Revolution seem sketch-like, or reminiscent of paintings done in plein air, and not brought to a high level of finish. Each of Fuchs's canvases depicts a particular place in Soviet Moscow, identified by name in the painting's subtitles: Sverdlov Square 1 and 2, Toilets under Spasskaya Tower, Lenin Museum. His broad brushstrokes are shot through by glimpses of the white prepared ground of the canvas, and the color palette used in many of the Pleshkas is drab, nondescript, but the persistent visibility of the white underpainting imparts on these compositions an airy quality. Though in some of the paintings the colors gray and mustard predominate, others bloom with brick and brilliant blue sky. Despite Fuchs's immovable subject matter, there is a lightness to the Pleshkas. This ephemerality does not simply owe to Fuchs's informal style, the banality of their content, or their depiction of sites of state commemoration in states of disarray. Fuchs's haphazard, almost careless compositional strategy conveys the sense that these paintings leave something unsaid, and each of these sites is indeed layered with signification. The term Pleshka in the project's title refers to another kind of clearing that mirrors the sparseness of Fuchs's application of the paint. With a joking, more figurative likeness, it translates to bald spot in Russian. One must know, however, that the term Pleshka also denotes a place in which late Soviet Moscow's gay male community would cruise, a place of sexual encounter, hidden in plain view. Though I will not be able to address all of them in this presentation, I argue that Fuchs's Pleshka projects, which include the series Pleshkas of the Revolution, the 2016 multimedia exhibition project Pleshka Birobidzhan, and the 2018 chapbook dictionary Mother Tongue, along with its 2019 exhibition component, refer to historical traditions of Soviet painting and monumental sculpture to imagine how visual art may serve both contemporary progressive politics and envision a contemporary relevance for the field of post-communist memory studies. I maintain that in Pleshkas of the Revolution, Fuchs attempts to create a counter-monument to a counter-public, Moscow's late Soviet gay community. Because of its logic, Fuchs's apparently banal images become sites of contestation for the legacy of neoliberalism itself, in the formerly communist world, but also perhaps on a broader international scale. The concept of the counterpublic, formulated by literary critic Michael Warner, is crucially important to understanding the significance of the Pleshkas, the bald spots of gay male sexual encounter on the head of normative sexuality in the USSR. Warner begins with the observation that the public sphere, singular, is better described as multiple publics. These publics are self-organized, quote, spaces of discourse organized by nothing other than discourse itself, end quote. For Warner, a public is predicted on the existence of signifying practices that can be picked up at different times by different people, who, outside of their receptivity to such practices, have no relation to one another. In fact, according to Warner, quote, a public sets its boundaries and its organization by its own discourse rather than by external frameworks, only if it openly addresses people who are identified primarily through their participation in the discourse, and who therefore cannot be known in advance. Appropriately, the idea of address to strangers who are not known in advance, yet can nevertheless be supposed to exist, is present in Fuchs's title itself, even if in practice, the information is provided to viewers only in accompanying texts. Warner builds on a definition of the counterpublic developed, among others, by feminist political theorist Nancy Fraser in the late 1980s and early 90s. Following German critical theorists Alexander Kluge and Oskar Necht, who distinguished the bourgeois public sphere, which dominates European theorization of public discourse throughout the second half of the 20th century, from the proletarian one. Nancy Fraser maintains that whenever public discourse is understood as the domain of a single overarching public, subaltern populations are excluded, leading them to create subaltern counterpublics. Fraser is explicitly concerned with subaltern groups united by distinct political demands. Warner, however, extends the designation counterpublic beyond, quote, ideas or policy questions to the speech genres and modes of address that constitute the public, end quote. The discourse that constitutes it is, quote, not merely a different or alternative idiom, but one that in other contexts would be regarded with hostility. The cultural horizon against which it marks itself off is not just a general or wider public, but a dominant or hegemonic one, end quote. In enumerating the ways in which a counterpublic functions like a public, but composed of those who are oppressed and or exploited under reigning conditions of economic and social inequality, Warner lays out a vision for a utopia of discourse. A specifically queer counterpublic, for example, is formed through address to a specifically queer audience, and no one else. It is thus a space in which, quote, no one is in the closet. The presumptive heterosexuality that constitutes the closet for individuals in ordinary speech is suspended, end quote. According to Warner, quote, addressing a queer public doesn't simply express the way that he and his friends live as queer people. It means committing himself and the fate of his world-making project to circulation among indefinite others. However much his address to them might be laden with intimate affect, it must also be extended impersonally, making membership available on the basis of mere attention. His world must be one of strangers. Warner is well aware that the specific nature of counterpublic address is an obstacle to broadening the circulation of counterpublic speech. In fact, he celebrates that it is protectively arcane. He notes that its very transmission, in publications of limited run and other protected venues, is enough to allow the counterpublic to assume a political agency comparable in form to that of the hegemonic public. For Warner, this risks a negative outcome. The counterpublic's entrance into the arena of broader political discourse signals a move away from the forms, structures, and spaces of sociability and performative community expression that brought it into being in the first place. When counterpublics, quote, acquire agency in relation to the state, they enter the temporality of politics and adapt themselves to the performatives of rational critical discourse, end quote. And in so doing, they, quote, cede the original hope of transforming the space of public life itself. How, Warner asks, will political counterpublics imagine their agency? The answer to this question provided by Fiex's practice might be by animating potential signifiers of a desired political emancipation, as opposed to mere enfranchisement, through artistic agency. Fiex's broader world-building project around the idea of Plieshka explores the tension between queer emancipation and the political and civil rights that may be imparted on select exemplars of a population otherwise quoted subaltern. In his 2018 text, Mother Tongue, Fieks describes the Plieshka, in all its historical and geographic specificity, as functioning much like a nation, because, quote, every people has its own language, and because a people cannot live without a language of its own, the Plieshka has its own thematic language, which Fieks maintains is, quote, an East Slavic language and the national language of the Russian LGBTIQ people, end quote. It has geographic boundaries, social hierarchies, a national literature, and a cultural production apparatus represented by the Plieshka Press and Fiex's Plieshkas of the Revolution. Fieks, whose current practice is multidisciplinary and often combines elements of social practice and performance art with his assuming more curatorial roles, reaches to his biography to explain the specific conceptual nature of his work as a contemporary painter. When Fieks paints, he alleges, he paints as a socialist realist, in the style in which he achieved proficiency as an art student in Moscow between 1987 and his emigration to the United States in 1993. Fiex's invocation of the language of nation-state building, as well as of the USSR's system of official recognition for artists, serves two purposes. First, the fact that Fieks thinks of his paintings as socialist realist reminds us that socialist realism, especially in the post-World War II period in the Soviet Union, encompassed a far wider range of styles than are represented by the severe official portraits of Soviet politicians that many in Western Europe and the United States associate with this style. Art historian Christina Kyer has written extensively on the lyrical 1930s socialist realism of decorated painter Alexander Dejneka. Yet a glimpse of Victor Popkov's canvas, May Day, of 40 years later, suggests that Dejneka was perhaps not so much an outlier as a particularly skilled example of one fanciful current that flowed into the broader stream of official Soviet painting. It is into this tradition that we might insert Fuchs. Second, homosexuality was not criminalized in the Soviet Union until 1934, and even once it had been, queer people were not wholly absent from official public life. Thus, Fuchs's invoking of a potentially heterogeneous, yet still politically instrumental socialist realism, while visualizing the largely hidden history of Soviet queer life, might thus prompt the viewer to question Warner's mistrust of the merits of marrying political action to counter public speech. Fuchs identifies the thematic language of the Plieshka as a, quote, protective, secret language, used by homosexual men in the USSR to communicate amongst themselves without attracting unwanted attention or risking harm. By 1991, however, there was a different terminology. The, quote, late Soviet blue, or goluboy, having entered the thematic language as a homophobic insult, quote, had become a term for the fully formed subject of local sexual dissidents, who understood perfectly well who he was, where he lived, and what his desires and priorities were, end quote. In other words, Goluboy had become a political affiliation. Plieshkas of the Revolution maps exceedingly well onto Michael Warner's formulation of the counterpublic. Fuchs's Plieshka project also, however, betrays a discontentment with prospects of subaltern populations achieving political emancipation under neoliberal capitalism. This is mainly achieved by recourse to what Fuchs in his artist statement calls, quote, a critical kind of nostalgia, whereby the work of memory becomes a tool for exposing and identifying the discrepancies of both the past and the present, end quote. Thus, Fuchs's identification with socialist realism as a style and Soviet sites as subject matter does not mean an uncritical appraisal of Soviet history. It does, however, acknowledge the void left by the passing of the world's most successful leftist state-building project. In a recent text titled The Theory of Plieshka, Evgeny Fuchs describes the ambiguous relationship that he, as a gay man who came of age during the last decade of the Soviet Union, would develop to what he calls the global gay argot, that ultimately found a hegemonic academic instantiation in some branches of queer theory. Work which some LGBTQ individuals in the West experienced as liberatory because it gestured towards desired forms of political emancipation was exported to formerly communist Europe alongside forms of shock therapy economic liberalization that in many countries, such as those of the former Soviet Union, often led to mass unemployment, dramatic declines in public health, and staggering income inequality. Fuchs's memorial, then, is to the idiosyncratic characteristics of local queer life that were compromised by the entry of the Soviet Union into the global free market, including the global art market and related cultural industries. Writing in 2009, the late theorist of performance studies José Esteban Muñoz identifies the dominant attitude of critique within academic cultural analysis, and indeed, brandished by the same forces that Fuchs blames for the erasure of local gay cultures, such as that present on the Plieshka, as one of anti-utopianism. Muñoz challenges the dominance of theoretical insights that have been stunted by the lull of presentness and romances of negativity. To formulate his counter-argument, Muñoz reaches to the theories of utopia advanced by unorthodox 20th century Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch. Muñoz points out that those strategies, such as evoking the past and what Theodor Adorno calls casting an image of the future, thinking on utopia allows us to do the work of letting us critique the present, to see beyond its what is, to worlds of political possibility, to what might be, end quote. Two of Bloch's contrasting conceptions of utopia are particularly useful to Muñoz, and these are helpful for understanding the ways in which Fuchs's project might point to the contemporary significance of post-communist memory studies. In The Principle of Hope, Bloch differentiates between the banal optimism of abstract utopia and the educated hope of concrete utopia. In the context of contemporary queer life, Munoz associates abstract utopia with, quote, an elite evasion of politics, end quote, in pursuit of integration into hegemonic, heteronormative culture. Concrete utopia, on the other hand, has an urgency that aligns it with Warner's vision for the stakes of taking on counterpublic forms of expression, knowing that doing so leaves the subject vulnerable to the agency of others. For Munoz, the assumption of queer political agency does not, as Warner believes, signal a voluntary capitulation to state organs of control and repression. Munoz sees the queer negativity that predominates the Academy as converging with abstract utopia, as each has a severely foreshortened sense of the future. From this perspective, it is nearly impossible to articulate any demands but those most rooted in the present. Often, these are assimilationist and masquerade as pragmatic and more doable, simply because they are rooted in extending purchase on the inequalities that structure the here and now to select queer subjects to whom they were previously denied. Quote, concrete utopias, by contrast, can be dreamlike, but they are the hopes of a collective, an emergent group, or even the solitary oddball, who is the one who dreams for many, end quote. Fix's Plieshka project seeks to build bridges across the period of post-Soviet rupture by raising awareness of the levels of signification present in the urban tapestry of post-communist Russia. Plieshka Birobidzhan, for example, is an elaborate exercise in world-building that imagines the Jewish autonomous province of Birobidzhan, incorporated in the 1920s as a land base and administrative center for Soviet Jewish people, as a queer leftist utopia. Its landmarks pay tribute to queer and internationalist leftist icons of the 20th century, with a town named Michel Foucault thrown in for good measure. Historian James E. Young would write of a generation of international artists who, starting in the late 1970s, came to see traditional monumental strategies as unfitting to commemorate the catastrophes of the 20th century, tied as they were to the nation-states and reigning economic orders that oversaw them. Young describes the forms and practices that emerged from this reconsideration of the memorial as producing, quote, brazen, painfully self-conscious memorial spaces conceived to challenge the very premises of their being, end quote. A particularly recognizable example of this is Günter Danmig's Stolpersteine project, started in 1992 to commemorate sites associated with the annihilation of Berlin's Jewish population. The small size of the Stolpersteine, as well as their physically confrontational presence in public space, speaks to a counter-monumentality that shares not only a sense of intimacy and vulnerability with Fix's Plieshka project, but also a degree of its ethical certainty. Despite the gentle humor evident in the premise of Plieshkas of Birobidzhan, the care with which Fix traces its map in gold ink is testament to his commitment to a vision of another possible world. The stakes of the entire Plieshka project are dynamic and far-reaching. If it is understood to embody Fix's sense that the promise of liberation made to the post-Soviet LGBTQ community by neoliberalism and its ambassadors within the hegemonic queer theory is a broken one, it can be seen as promoting the sort of solidarity with time that media theorist Boris Groys extrapolates from the etymology of the term contemporary to be the mission of contemporary art. They also share common cause with the concrete utopian ambitions that José Esteban Munoz identifies in a 16-point manifesto from 1970 by the early gay liberation organization Third World Gay Revolution. This sweeping policy platform begins with nothing less than a demand for, quote, the right to self-determination for all third world and gay people, end quote. End quote. The right to be gay, anytime, any place. The right to free dress and adornment, end quote. It concludes with a solidaristic call for the, quote, liberation of humanity, free food, shelter, free education, free art for all, end quote. In other words, quote, a new society, a revolutionary socialist society, end quote, in which the needs of the people come first. One might glimpse a germ of this society between Fix's, quote, critical kind of nostalgia and the furtive glances, hurried brushstrokes on the surfaces of the plishkas of the revolution.